Hello, I'm Nicole Passini. I'm the Assistant Director of Glendale Library Arts and Culture. On behalf of all the public libraries in Los Angeles, Ventura, and beyond, thank you for joining the Southern California Library Cooperative and my library for this event, which is part of our series, Be the Change, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Anti-Racism. Be the Change events build collective understanding of systemic racism, elevate the voices and stories of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and inspire our communities to be the change. This series is generously supported by the City of Glendale Arts and Culture Commission and Outlook newspapers. We are so excited to celebrate Pride Month, and with us tonight are Meredith Talusan and Kima Jones. Meredith Talusan is the author of Fairest, a widely praised memoir which Kirkus Reviews called captivatingly eloquent. It was excerpted in the New York Times, selected as a most anticipated book of 2020 by O, the Oprah magazine, and is the People and In Style magazine pick for June. Meredith is founding executive editor of Them, Condé Nast's first ever platform devoted to the queer community. An award-winning journalist and author, Meredith has written features, essays, and opinion pieces for many publications, including The Guardian, The New York Times, The Atlantic, Vice Magazine, Wired, The Nation, Mike, BuzzFeed News, and The American Prospect. She's the recipient of the 2017 GLAAD Media Award for Outstanding Digital Journalism and has contributed to several books, including Nasty Women, Feminism, Resistance, and Revolution in Trump's America. Kima Jones is the founder of Jack Jones Literary Arts and an agent at Triangle House Literary. Her memoir, Butch, is forthcoming from Knopf in 2023. We encourage you to email questions throughout the talk to libraryinfo@glendaleca.gov, or you can use the live chat in YouTube. And now I'll turn the virtual mic over to Meredith and Kima.
Hello, my love.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. I hear you're on East Coast time, like me, even though you're an LA person. And I kind of love this, kind of like these time shifts that we're all experiencing in this virtual world that we've been living in the past few months. But I'm also looking forward to seeing people in person.
Absolutely.
And I think you told me that you wanted me to read something.
Yeah, love if you, first, thank you to the Glendale Library for having us. For sure. Thank you for the invitation. Glad to be here in conversation with Meredith. I would love for you to just jump in for those who, whether you've read Fairest or not, I think it's really important to start conversations out, listening, having heard the author and being able to jump right into the voice of the book. So let's get a 5-minute excerpt from the memoir.
Okay, wonderful. And for people who haven't read the book, one of the things that you should know about me is that I am albino and from the Philippines. But the relevant thing about me being albino is that it's actually hard for me to read the font of my own book because I have vision problems, which is why I am reading from my iPad. And I thought that it would be appropriate for me to read a passage about libraries. And the way that the book is structured, it has a number, it covers my life from the time, from my early childhood in the Philippines until I transitioned in my early 20s. But then there are also these sections that flash forward in time that are kind of about the effects of my decisions during that early period on my later life. And this is one of those sections. I returned to Harvard to speak at a panel in March 2018. Though I'd spoken at a number of universities, it did feel significant, but also amusing that my alma mater had finally invited me back. I was such a troublemaker in college, a self-branded queer radical who got removed from protests and threatened with arrest for public indecency. I decided to come to Harvard Yard a few hours before my talk. Not quite spring, too cold to walk around without a coat, the trees still barren. I came through the side entrance facing Massachusetts Hall on a Friday afternoon in the middle of the semester and encountered the usual sprinkling of human figures, a couple of students with expressions of grave attention, tourists seeking pictures in front of the bronze John Harvard statue. I had the overwhelming feeling of being out of place as I passed that monument and came to the other side of the yard, the part I had traversed hundreds, maybe even thousands of times before. Sorry, can you still hear me? Yes.
You're back now.
I briefly came out. I passed that monument and came to the other side of the yard, the part I had traversed hundreds, maybe even thousands of times before, from my dorm at Wigglesworth in the very corner of that vast lawn, toward my various classes, where I also felt out of place. Back then, it was the typical alienation of being a poor college student in the world's richest school, but over time, it turned into feeling alienated from the person Harvard wanted to make of me, someone who was supposed to think freely so that I could be groundbreaking and innovative, yet also conform to whatever arbitrary standard the university decided I should meet. Harvard reminded me of a fickle father who encouraged you to break the rules, except you were never allowed to undermine his authority. From the distance of a quarter century, I now had enough perspective to acknowledge how my experiences at school had shaped me, and that many of my conflicts with administrators were a form of acting out desires I couldn't reasonably expect them to understand, let alone fulfill. Yet speaking at Harvard was a final, grudging admission that the institution I fought with for so long was also one that gave me the tools to be the person I ultimately wanted to be, someone who made an impact in the world while remaining true to the parts of myself I cherished, which I managed not to give up, even though Harvard tried to discipline them away. But now, accepting how I'd grown into a person that both I and Harvard approved of also made it harder to grapple with the struggle it took to get to that place, as if feeling even a modicum of satisfaction betrayed the part of me that suffered for so long. I wondered about other people I could have become had I made different decisions, a professor in the Philippines, or the dutiful grandson who took over the family business once my grandfather died. Or I could still be a gay man in a 20-year relationship with the love of my life, no doubt married, maybe even with adopted children. In that agitated state, there was only one place that could ease my mind. I felt a little pathetic as I scaled those 36 concrete steps up to the entrance of Widener Library, but it really was the building on campus where I felt most safe. When I entered through the gilt and glass doors to that building's lobby, encased in marble, with a row of pillars on each side, the opulence no longer intimidated me, knowing how this part of the building was for donors and tourists, while the best part was what the public didn't see. I will just leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Meredith. That actually really segues really great into my first question, my first two questions. And so I really want to stick to craft-based questions for those who haven't read, and just in general, I think they're more exciting. So you put together a book proposal, signed a contract, right? What happened when you got that now what moment where you're like, okay, I signed a contract to tell the story of my life, and now I have to tell that story. How did you get past yourself, your fears, all of that in order to really take the book from proposal to Fairest? How did you get past sometimes those voices in our head that creep in?
Yeah, I mean, I felt like when I sold Fairest, I was in the middle of founding and running an editorial team at Condé Nast. And in a way, it was sort of a blessing in disguise that I was so busy that I didn't really, I had worked on the proposal for a long time, but that particular period of time when the proposal was being, you know, kind of vetted and sold was just a time of, you know, of incredible amounts of work for me. And so I feel like what basically happened was I sold the book, you know, the book was there, and then there was this sort of delayed reaction. And then maybe like a month later, you know, like I sat down and said to myself, okay, like what would it take for me to write the book in the best possible form that it could? And that was when I made, you know, the concrete plans to leave my full-time job as an editor and be part-time at Condé Nast. That was when I made the decision that it was really important for me to be in a space where there weren't people around that I would feel logistically or emotionally responsible to. So that was a period of time when what I asked people was, I asked friends, like, what is a place that is like the Philippines, but isn't the Philippines? Because I wanted to go somewhere that reminded me of home, but didn't make me feel emotionally tied to people, and didn't make me feel like I would feel responsible to other people's feelings as I was working on the book. And so that place ended up being Guatemala, where I was in the Lake Atitlan area of Guatemala for about 6 weeks. And that was when it was during those 6 weeks that I finished the draft, and, you know, like, and cried a lot, you know, like having, but it was also in those 6 weeks that I experienced that moment where you know, where you feel like, oh, like this is what the book is about, you know, because I think when you're in a proposal stage, you know, it's so much about trying to present the work to other people so that they would understand it. And I feel like the work of actually finishing the book was so much more about, you know, about me understanding my experiences for myself.
So that's exactly what my next question is. So, like, how does one protect themselves while they're writing down these experiences and beginning to understand them for themselves? So, like, how did you protect yourself, from your past and your experiences, right? As you're processing, how are you protecting yourself, even like in the writing on the page? Were there craft tricks or, you know, isolation tricks? What did you do to make sure that you were all right while you were writing this during those 6 weeks?
Yeah, I, to be perfectly honest, like, there were ways in which I didn't protect myself, and it was probably, you know, like, I feel like if I had to sort of like do that experience over again, you know, like, I felt like I was really lucky in the sense that even though I was completely isolated and didn't know anybody, I met very kind people who were very supportive, who can tell, you know, that I wasn't always in the best place. And, you know, and the people, sorry, can people hear me? Yes. I just had a little technical glitch on my end. You know, like, one of the, for me, you know, that was really important, actually. I found that human contact ended up being important. And I think in the future, I feel like I would have definitely found a way to have, you know, kind of like more systems in place. Friends that I could, you know, talk to about the work and about, you know, like the difficulties that I was having. But I also, you know, but I have definitely developed, you know, like a number of ways to work through some of those issues, because when you're working on a book that is like so close to you and your emotions, there's this really fine balance, because on the one hand, you need to be close enough to your emotions to be able to render them, both accurately and compellingly on the page, but at the same time, like not be so close to them that they burn you, right?
Right.
And I was definitely on the very edge of that, like by the time that I finished Fairest. And I think for me, like definitely like writing saves me in all of these ways, and reading saves me in all of these ways, right? Like I remember having, Jennifer Finney Boylan's book, She's Not There, Lydia Yuknovich's book, Alex Shee's, both Edinburgh and How to Write How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. So I did have, Giovanni's Room, right? Like having writers who are, who are depicting really difficult experiences and producing, just such wonderful, wonderful work that has made an indelible impression on me, really scaffolded me during that period. And the other thing that I do a lot actually is I find that focusing on certain aspects of scene and certain aspects of language then allows me to sort of like touch those, those difficult emotional moments. But then, like see this other, the important aspect of art in those moments. And, and that's been really super important in terms of me sort of like a lot of times, like for instance, there's a passage in the book that was really, really difficult to write about me being chased by men in a car. And, that gets in the prologue of the book. It's in the beginning of the book. And I remember writing that scene and just being really preoccupied with, like, how do I depict on the page this feeling of time slowing down, right? Like in a, the way, the paradox of, of like a moment that is simultaneously just like an instant, but at the same time feels incredibly, incredibly long. And I just remember, just being really preoccupied with, like the physical details of the space, with, like with the clacking of my heels against the brick, with, like the contrast between the black asphalt and, like, and the white lines of paint on the crosswalk, so that then, I just, kind of like look up from my page. And once the scene is rendered, I feel like I'm able to, I'm able to think of it outside of myself in a way that is actually really healing and important, right? And so definitely, the craft is a really important component as well of me being able to sort of take care of myself through these processes. Yeah.
Thank you for saying that. And the passage that you're referring to honestly brings into mind just the beginning of our conversation this evening, when we're talking about like, right, the space and time continuum, and like jumping and crossing in these kinds of ways. And so I want to talk about memoir as a way, right? It's like an interrogation, almost a meeting of the past self, the present self, and the future self, right? That's what memoir is. And as someone who's currently writing one, right? Some days I'm like, wow, my future Kima, past Kima, present Kima. And you do it so, and you talked about it a little bit, but I would love to know more in a craft context. How did you sort of like, were you able to say, okay, future Meredith, you need to be quiet right now. This chapter is for present Meredith, or how did you go about knowing at where you needed to be in the space and time continuum, craft-wise, to bring this all together so beautifully?
One of the really important aspects of at least the process of writing this book for me has been, to understand that, especially that period of my life of early transition and the decisions around transitioning were extremely, extremely tumultuous, and were and that in general, like my life has been tumultuous, but also there are ways in which I developed a lot of defense mechanisms around the tumultuousness of that life, right? Like I definitely have used my white passing, especially in college, in ways that I now find, not just problematic, but really like offensive to myself, and that also, like I was highly, highly preoccupied with feminine beauty, at the beginning of my transition in ways that I feel like were certainly emotionally unhealthy, right? And so it was really important for me, especially because of the fact that trans women's memoirs as a genre has been really characterized by trying to make our experiences, kind of like as, like as sympathetic to a cisgender audience as possible.
Right.
So it was really important for me to, to write a memoir, both for myself that owned up to all of that messiness, and also for the sake of a public to show that, my life can be this messy, and I can make all of these really terrible decisions, and I can be, like in a lot of ways, like not an ideal person, but, like you still need to respect my decisions around, like around being trans, and also like around needing to navigate as a disabled albino person, gender nonconforming person, immigrant, in this, in this just really intense, really difficult environment of, of an elite college, right? And so I think one of the things that really evolved was me really, really consciously holding future Meredith back, right? And also I think having written so many op-eds and so many, kind of like news-related items, and being so excessively political in my opinion work, I wanted the reader to make their own decisions about, and their own judgments about my life and about, about the trajectory of that life. And so I really, really held future Meredith back. And I think that was how the structure evolved, where there are these discrete flash forwards, because I really wanted, like to focus on the effects of those decisions without me, like feeling, while at the same time not having future Meredith, say, well, yes, like this is a decision I regret, or, like this is a problem, and like this isn't, like this isn't something that I would have done today, like if it was, like if it was a decision that, if it was something that I was doing today, I wanted the reader to make that, to make those, to have those experiences with me and evaluate those experiences for themselves without, without future Meredith telling them what to think of past Meredith, right?
Right. I love what you said about judgment. It's so right, because and there's a way that, like, right, we become implicated, but you I love how you're talking about this emotional distance, which makes me want to ask you, right? Fairest was published a year ago, at the height, at the beginning of the pandemic. And so I'm wondering, at all, has your relationship to narrative nonfiction deepened? You're a trained, Harvard educated, award-winning journalist. Do you feel that the genre of, do you feel like memoir served this story? Do you feel that it's still serving? Are there ways that you still want to work in narrative nonfiction, or has this experience of writing Fairest pushed you over to the fiction side? I'd love to know how this book has reshaped your writing life, especially now having a year hindsight.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like my relationship to my writing is always unpredictable and dynamic, and and I write in all of these different genres, right? I've pretty much published, I published features and opinion pieces and, narrative nonfiction and memoir. And I'm going to start publishing fiction as of early next year. I'll be in a fiction collection. And I've actually even published poetry. So which we know we see eye to eye. And so for me, it's really hard to figure, to determine how I'm going to feel, because I have definitely been in a fiction space, not because, oddly, not because of any negative experiences surrounding publishing Fairest, but more that one of the things that I realize about myself is that when I write fiction, I always think I've already revealed the most of myself. I at the time that I published this memoir, I felt like I was the most vulnerable I could possibly be. And one of the things that I've discovered in fiction, working on fiction, is actually no. Actually, there are places that my heart doesn't want to write in nonfiction, and that there are places where what my heart wants to do is put, all of these feelings that I have, and put them in a different character or a different setting or a different, a different context, and that it actually allows me to explore those issues in ways that I wouldn't have otherwise. And that's been a really big impetus for me right now working on fiction. I've been, I've just been playing around. I've been working on stories. I've been doing this thing where I've been kind of writing opening sections or first chapters of novels and then leaving them alone. And then, and then deciding, and then being okay, once the honeymoon period is over, do I still feel like I can commit to this project for the long term? And I feel like I've done at this point, 5 opening chapters of 5 different novels. And I feel like there's definitely one that is that's been occupying my brain. So I feel like I've landed on the one that I do want to work on for as my sort of big next project. But I also I do look forward to whether it might end up being in fiction, but clearly it can also possibly be in memoir. I do look forward to writing on the experience of waking up being a post-transition trans woman and thinking to myself, okay, what now? Right? And then narrating like narrating what happens after that. Like there is definitely like another memoir in my head. I just don't know if I will be emotionally prepared to write it. So we'll see what happens.
We'll see. And I wrote down 5 different opening chapters. I'm definitely going to borrow that idea. I love the idea of just going with the inspiration, seeing what comes out, putting away, and then looking back in a month or 2 and saying, hey, does this still resonate? And am I still thinking about this? Do I still feel called to do this? Because I save all the drafts of I have college drafts of poems. I mean, I save all that stuff because it's nice to reread and go, oh my God, yes, I do know how to write a sentence. When you kind of forget. I want to, now that we're more than halfway through, I do want to get into the book a little. And for those who haven't read, I don't want to give anything away. I don't like when folks do that, but there is a love story. There's a love story at the heart of the book. And there's so much vulnerability that had to happen in order to render that story and tell that story. And so I want to talk for a minute just about the queer love story. Can you talk about the first time you remember seeing or being enthralled specifically with queer loves? What was the first queer love story that you loved? And maybe what are the queer love stories that informed you as you were working through like these really tender and often sometimes like excruciating moments in the book? And I want to allow you space, because I mean, to talk about and I'm not even just thinking about sexual relationships, just all the ways that we love, all the love stories that are available to us, but especially within our sexual relationships, because as queer people, our sexual relationships have really been depicted in a very particular way where, it's kind of doomsday. We don't get to be in love. So yeah.
I mean, it's funny to think about. Queer love stories specifically, just because, like growing up in the Philippines, right? The Philippines is a very specific context in which queer people are sort of an integrated part of society, but it's also a deeply Catholic, there's this sort of like deep layer of Catholicism. So, so there were all of these love stories that were happening around me, but I didn't realize that they were there because I was a kid. And there was this cultural assumption that third gender people are, are allowed to exist and they're part of society, but they're not desirable, right? So, so from the time that I was a kid, certainly my experience has been, my experience was that I didn't really see tangible love stories. And so I had to, I had to make ones up on my own, right? I had to, I discuss Miss Saigon in the book a lot, which is this, for people who don't know, it's this musical, and the protagonist, Lea Salonga, or the actress who played the protagonist, who was this Vietnamese bar girl who meets a white man at a bar in Saigon during the Vietnam War, and they end up falling in love, but they end up, sort of like being tragically separated. There was this way in which, I read aspects of queerness in that musical because of the way in which, it was about people who couldn't, come together, who had all of these differences, who their societies didn't approve of, of their love. Kim in the show had this Vietnamese man who she was supposed to marry, who she refused, and all of these terrible things happened. And so my relationship to queer love has always been, just sort of really, really complicated. And then I moved to a conservative part of California, Chino, California, where I also, wasn't really particularly exposed to queerness, where, that was at the time, pretty anti-queer and homophobic. And so, and it's really funny because it was another musical, in 1992, I happened to be watching the Tony Awards, and there was this musical called Falsettos, which featured, two gay men, one of whom ends up, struggling with AIDS. And that was really, my first exposure to, to an actual queer, to an explicitly queer relationship. And of course, I saw the musical as soon as I had the opportunity. And yeah, so I feel like theater was really kind of like my first exposure, and then Angels in America shortly afterwards. And those really kind of like catalyzed a lot of my feelings and experiences around queerness. But as a result, all of those examples of explicit queerness that I gave were all about white gay men, right? And that also, was the lens through which I viewed my queer experiences until pretty late, until I was in my early 20s.
Can you also just talk about, I think it would be really great just to know, unfortunately, right? Well, let me rewind that. I don't want to start out by saying unfortunately. I want to say that I am incredibly proud of you and I want to congratulate you. And I think it's wonderful that yours is the first memoir by a Filipina albino trans woman published in this country. I'm also wondering if you can talk a little bit about, grappling with the unfortunate part about being the first to do the thing, and what that feels like, and just this question in and of itself. But how has it been being the first person to do this?
Right. I mean, I feel like that's been characteristic of my experience in all of these ways, right?
Right.
I was the first trans staff writer at BuzzFeed. I was the first, trans person in executive position at Condé. So I guess I'm used to it. But at the same time, it does, and I relish, sort of like my ability to open doors for people and to, both at a practical level, sort of being able to facilitate, other people being able to, to work in, in various positions and, and helping other trans writers, et cetera, as well as, as well as being able to sort of expose people to experiences and to points of view that they may not have been exposed to before. At the same time, it's very lonely. It can be really lonely and difficult because on the one hand, it can feel wonderful that I have points of contact with so many different experiences and so many different people. But at the same time, I often feel like, this is something that, that other people just wouldn't be able to understand, right? That I am obviously like in community with, with other Filipino people, but, but it's just very difficult to talk to them about like some of my experiences around white passing and the way in which, my relationship to white passing has shaped me, right?
Right.
Or people often assume that I'm native born and they don't understand why my perspectives can feel radically different from theirs. And so that's something that I experience on a regular basis. And it's difficult, and I feel like so much of the reason why I am so enamored with reading and writing, and why I feel, just so fortunate to be able to be a writer in this world and sustain myself is that it really is the one place where I feel like people build worlds with their imaginations. And so, and when I talk in, like in the excerpt that I read about libraries being the places where I feel the most safe, like I really feel that because they're the places where, like it's individual consciousnesses creating worlds for themselves, which then allows me, that's how I live vicariously through those experiences, because I so consistently feel the sort of like singularity and the uniqueness of my experience and how difficult it can be to communicate it to other people.
Yeah. And one of the big themes of this book is seeing, right? And right? And being seen and being seen the way we want to be seen. And I guess there are two questions I have before we turn it over, but I guess my final question, just in terms of being seen. And when I think about you, so for those who don't know, Meredith and I met years ago at the Jack Jones Literary Arts Retreat. And we developed our own friendship since then. But one of the things that I really admire about Meredith is just, I love, Guatemala, Mexico, the Philippines. There's a way at the retreat, and since I've known you, where you just get up and go and like take in an environment, right? Kind of take it all into your body, absorb it, and then you write. And so I'm wondering if you could just talk about that, about maybe about changing environment and perception and just the experience of being able to see these different places, take what you need from the environment, metabolize it, and then give it to us as something that's going to nourish us and heal us as much as it heals you.
Yeah, I certainly, it's one of the things that I love to do is to be in a different place, because every place that I'm in, like gives me something different. And I also just really enjoy the feeling of, just the feeling of being alone with my thoughts, while also at the same time, like it's really fun. It's really interesting because I really relish both the experience of having that, of being alone with my thoughts, and then like a Jack Jones retreat or other residencies that I've been to, of then convening with other people, later, right? And then coming back and being really in touch with myself about, like what I need from an experience in particular moments. And then there are definitely times when I really just like, just sort of like running off on my own. And it's funny just because I feel like, I feel like I got the inspiration for this from Black writers, right? From Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou, where, like this experience of like just really prioritizing yourself, prioritizing your work, prioritizing the perspective that you bring to the world, and figuring out like what you need in order to, in order to express yourself. And for me, that has meant periodically, just disappearing into a place where I don't know anybody, and feeling like, like just feeling this freedom of thought, and feeling like, just because anywhere I am, like I just feel the sort of evaluation and the judgment of people around me. And even when they're not doing it, I wonder if they are.
Right.
And so there's something about these sorts of hermetic environments where I don't have to think about that has been really important to me in terms of my writing process. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Meredith. And thank you, everyone. We're going to open it up for questions. And before we do, I just want to say again, thank you to Glendale Library. If you have not read Fairest, please do. There's so much we couldn't talk about, from embodiment to pleasure, just to think, right? Again, the lived experience in the body. There's so much I wanted to go into there, but we just don't have time in the hour. So make sure that you check out Fairest for sure. I'm going to go into the chat box. I'm going to try to figure this out. A year into the pandemic, and I'm still not great about figuring out all of the, oh, here we go, chat. Okay. Okay, so we had someone who wants to know, can you talk a little bit about building the proposal?
Yeah, I mean, like a book proposal usually involves, just an introduction to the book, what you intend to write, a number of sample chapters from the book. And, like, I think those are really like the two most important parts, and also like your biography. There are other, like depending on the book, there are other parts, like, like you write about, like other books that are comparable to yours, or you talk about like your plans for promoting the book. In my case, actually, my intention was to write the entire book and then try to sell it. And then, like when I got a full-time job, that became too difficult. So I actually ended up producing, I submitted a lot more than what is in a usual proposal. I believe I submitted around 100 pages of the manuscript at the time. And then, and yeah, and I'm not 100% sure that was that was the question that was being asked. Like in terms of what was contained in the proposal, the proposal was really very much like followed. I ended up writing a book that at least structurally was very close to the proposal, which was that I wanted to write a book that talked about my experience as an albino kid growing up in a rural part of the Philippines and then moving to America, and how that and being seen as white once I moved to America, and how those experiences around race and like and migration and moving to from one place to the other, like from one context to the other, being seen in all of these different ways, then affected my eventual decision to transition and live my life, live my life this far as a woman. Yeah.
So we have another question from the chat, and then there's one more that didn't make it, but I want to make sure that we address it. And that is, before we jump into Nicole's question, if there's any advice, this question's always coming, but specifically for emerging trans writers. And when I say emerging, I mean of all ages, right? Folks who are new to writing or publishing. If you're thinking of any advice for emerging trans writers on how to better be with themselves, be with people, pitch work, just general advice. It is Pride. For queer and trans writers starting out, do you have any advice on just general life, being comfortable with yourself and being comfortable with other people, and then being comfortable on the page? And then we'll jump into Nicole's final question.
Yeah, one of the things that that I think is really important is having an ongoing conversation with yourself about, like your preparedness and, and how you feel emotionally about, like about writing for a public, right? And I think that writing in general is very important for anybody, but it's particularly important for people who have experiences that they don't have models for, because or that there are not as many models as other experiences, right? Like now we have Pose, now we have Euphoria, but, like we're inundated with media about, cis people, right? And so there's this way that writing and, and art in general is just a really good way for queer and trans people to be able to work through what they're working through. And it has always been that for me. And like I continue to express myself through art regardless of, regardless of whether or not I think of the process of creation of art making as really quite separate from the process of like putting work out there, right? You can see in the background, I have a guitar. My pandemic hobby has been learning the guitar and getting back into music, which I don't anticipate will have any professional value, but but I feel like it's been very important for me to process my emotions through that, through that medium, especially during this difficult time. And so that's the first thing. And then secondly, like in terms of getting started, like increasingly there are venues and, like in mentorships for people who are, like for people who belong to underrepresented groups. Like I started a project at the beginning of the pandemic called the Fairest Writer, where, like I and a bunch of, like now we have a number of volunteers.
That's the final question. Nicole's final question was for you to talk about the Fairest workshops and the evolution. So you're right there.
Oh, great. Okay, fantastic. So yeah, and, so if you just go to my website, mtalusan.com, there's a tab for community, and I work with a bunch of writers and industry professionals to, in order to sort of try to open up, the field of writing and media to as many people as possible. And, like, and in the process of doing that, I'm, like certainly am in an ongoing, like discussion with people about, like about ways to, like ways to mentor and to help out queer writers. There's a queer art mentorship organization. There is there's just like a number of mentorship organizations that have popped up as a reason, like even within the last few years. And I feel like those have been a really important part of the ecosystem. But I feel like, for me, what has really worked has just been to develop my writing practice for myself and to check in with myself about, like what my goals are with my writing and, and how I can become, you know, like a better writer on a day-to-day basis, and, you know, like who I can learn from, what I can read, you know, like both in terms of craft books and in terms of, you know, like work that I admire, and just, you know, kind of like doing that continuously for my own pleasure. And then, you know, like, and then doing it for a public kind of follows, you know, like I feel like, at least for me, it was an organic transition to writing for a public. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Again, everyone, thank you for being here. Please read Fairest. I learned so much about learning how to better be with myself. After reading it, I learned so much about standing up for myself and boundaries. And just, again, Meredith, when you were talking about just taking that emotional space and not having an emotional links, selfishly, when asked to do this conversation, I was like, of course, because I'm through your work, I'm learning so much also while completing Butch, and just in general, writer to writer, I really appreciated the level of vulnerability you displayed on the page. I'm so happy to be in the sisterhood with you and to know you, and that we got to meet all those years ago in New Mexico. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Yeah, and, you know, thank you, Kima, for, you know, being my conversant, and I absolutely cannot wait for Butch. I hope to read it as soon as possible, you know, hot off the presses. And thank you so much, you know, to the folks at Glendale Public Library for inviting me. It was an enormous pleasure. I was telling to people earlier that my maternal grandfather actually lived in Glendale when I was in high school. He unfortunately has passed away, but so, you know, so I have fond memories of visiting, and I hope to visit, you know, to visit in person once, you know, once we're all able to do that. And yeah, and thank you so much.
Absolutely. We should probably also just say really quickly, shout out to Anthony Ocampo, who also shouted out the Glendale Library and their love for Filipino high school students. He made sure to say that on Twitter, and how the Glendale Library specifically was a safe haven for him and other queer teens growing up. And I think it's really important. Anthony is a Culture too, Jack Jones Rare Arts alum. So I just want to say thank you to the Glendale Library for being a safe space for queer Filipina kids since the 90s. And again, so grateful to be here this evening. Thank you.
What wonderful kudos for us. Thank you. I'm so happy to hear that. That's wonderful. Thank you both for this just wonderful conversation. I, you know, felt like listening in on a chat between friends. So thank you. It was really, really delightful.
Thank you.
I really appreciate you joining us. And please, we're open now. Our physical building is open, so come on by and visit us anytime. We'd love to see you, to the viewers and to both of our panelists. So
wonderful.
Amazing.
I just want to let viewers know that Glendale Library Arts and Culture has a lot of fun events celebrating Pride Month. From drag queen story time this Saturday to an effort to document LGBTQIA history in Glendale. There's a lot happening at the library, so check out the schedule on our website. You can use the link there. Again, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and big thanks to Meredith and Kima.